My name is Matthew Levering, and I teach theology at Mundelein Seminary. And I hold the James N. and Mary D. Perry Jr. Chair of Theology. I mention that because they're personal friends of mine, and I just feel very grateful to be associated with their work. I enjoy writing theology simply as a matter of personal learning. I'm always motivated by some question that I feel that I lack understanding and I lack background. Books arise out of particular questions, and I have 2 or 3 styles of book that I write, and so when I write different styles, that will determine the shape of the book, and it will determine also how many people will be interested in the way that I'm approaching it. The current one is engaged in Doctrine of Marriage, and the purpose there is to reflect upon marriage, the marriage of God and humanity, as the very purpose of creation. That's the meaning of creation. That's what God created everything for, is marriage of God and the cosmos. The marriage of human beings is a sign of the marriage of Christ and the church, the marriage of God and humanity, and then, of course, and more broadly, the marriage of God and the whole created cosmos. So human marriage then is a sign of that, and so I do treat human marriage quite extensively in this volume. And so, it's very important to me that this be kept under the rubric of the marriage of God and humanity, the whole purpose of the creation of everything. So that's kind of crucial, I think. I think that theologies of marriage that don't place, they don't really begin in a very deep way with the marriage of God and humanity. Those theologies of marriage are going to be theologically thin and not going to be particularly helpful ultimately, because they've lost their place within the mysteries of our faith. Marriage as a human reality, as a sacramental reality, marriage is a sign of that union of Christ and church, or union of God and humanity that Israel was promised. That was the whole promise given to Israel, that this would come about. And it has been inaugurated. It hasn't been completed, but it hasn't been consummated. But it's been inaugurated by Jesus Christ. And so marriage then in the Christian context, and ultimately really marriage in the human context. The meaning is symbolic and points toward the very purpose of what it means to be a human person. Well, people ask, what does it really mean to be human in light of marriage? And so I think one place I begin there, after a lengthy chapter where I discuss the marriage of God and humanity, and our purpose in that regard, I begin with the whole issue of whether the image of God, whether there's a marital image of God, the nature of the image of God, what it means to be in the image of God. And so there I'm not comfortable, thinking of the image of God just in terms of a married couple, because of course then people who were not married would not be in the image of God. So of course that's ridiculous. But there is something about marital fruitfulness and self-surrender that can be applied to every person, including Jesus Christ our Lord. That radical self-surrender, that radical fruitfulness. I think that's crucial element of the marital vocation, and that aspect, belongs to the image of God and characterizes the image of God, and that's a fruitful self-surrender. That's who God is, and that's who we are. So that's very important, I think, for understanding marriage. What is marriage? What's sort of the core of marriage? Well, fruitful self-surrender. And that's an image of God, and that's important, and that's related to our vocation. Whether we're single, whether we're celibate for the kingdom, whether we're married, but that fruitful self-surrender, that's really at the heart of being related to Christ. That's who Christ is. That's who we're called to be, and that's where we find the happiness that God has made us for, which is Him. People ask, what is fruitful self-surrender? And ultimately, of course, fruitful self-surrender is love. And of course, in a marital context, it's fruitful in the sense that it's open to new life, to the sharing of life. But of course, in a spiritual context, it's simply, it's part of the fact that we are made for divine life, divine love. And so there is a spiritual fruitfulness that comes from self-surrender, and that is bringing people into the kingdom. Sharing the gospel, bringing people into the kingdom. Sharing the new life in Christ. And so that's fruitful self-surrender. But I think fruitful self-surrender in a marital context really means being open to life in a responsible way, in a way that is befitting of our human nature as free persons. But that's what I've got in mind. Well, sometimes when theologians talk about fruitful self-surrender, people who I meet kind of wonder, is this real? Does this connect with real life? It often seems a bit idealized, a bit sort of sentimental, romanticized, and talking about fruitful self-surrender, when I'd probably fight for a cup of coffee instead of self-surrendering, I would fight for a cup of coffee with somebody, tooth and nail if I was in line at Starbucks or something and they'd jump me. Anyway, so people ask whether this is real. So I do have two chapters on original sin, marriage and original sin, and marriage and the cross. Because I really think that if we're going to talk about marriage and fruitful self-surrender and our vocation to be united with God in that marital intimacy in eternal life, even now, beginning in the kingdom, I think if we're going to talk about these type of matters, we need to really be realistic. And so in terms then of my work on marriage, my book on marriage, I turn fairly early in the book to the whole issue of original sin and the fact that it was committed by a married couple. And so I kind of ask, does it matter that the first married couple committed this sin according to Scripture? And so I go through different points. I'm of course aware that Paul talks about the sin of Adam, but I take a look especially at the church fathers, and they consistently present the original sin, the stories. They consistently present this sin as a sin of a married couple, and it's very important, really, because you see then what they think is self-surrendering fruitfulness. But you also see kind of the devastation, So there has been a devastation, and marriage is caught up in that. But the marriage in some ways is part of that, in terms of the sin as this couple turned inward, and so that marriage it's not as though it's some sort of innocent, idealized realm, where two persons come together to behave perfectly and then live forever with God. So that's very important to me that we try to think concretely about the issue of sin and marriage. And then therefore I also want marriage, a real theology of marriage needs to have a lot to say about the cross of Jesus Christ. So of course marriage is not a crucifixion. It may be for my wife, but definitely not for me. But marriage is not, that was a joke. But so marriage is not a crucifixion. But on the other hand, there is no marriage that is not in need of redeeming. There's no human relationship that's not in need of redeeming. You see, and there's no marriage of God and humanity. There's no fulfillment of that promise that God gives to Israel without the cross of Jesus Christ. So the cross is right at the heart of marriage, even in terms of its sign character, as it points toward the fullness of the kingdom. That marriage, that intimate marriage that is unfathomably glorious, that we can't even hardly conceive. But so the cross is so important, and it's important to see that in our self-surrendering fruitfulness, The cross is going to be crucial to that. And forgiveness, then, mercy. And then also recognizing ourselves as sinners. And just being willing to be vulnerable to each other. Being willing to deal with severe hardship, caused often by each other, or just simply caused by the fact that the world is a very, very difficult place. So the cross in marriage, that's just absolutely crucial, I think. Otherwise, you get some sort of romanticized portrait of, a couple exists to make each other happy, and you're going to have your dog and your house in some suburbs or some beautiful area, and some sort of romanticized portrait that just isn't the Christian view of marriage. And really isn't about self-surrendering fruitfulness, and it's not about, maybe it's about kind of a consumer sense of happiness. Maybe it's simply a physical, some sort of physical happiness, whether it's kind of you go hiking together and you do a lot of sports, you travel a lot together, you go to 80 different countries and hike in the Himalayas together or whatever. That's not Christian marriage, though. Christian marriage is something deeper than that. So that's very important to me in my book. When I write about marriage, the eschatological is always central to me. Although, of course, in my Engaging Doctrine series, I am leaving eschatology till the final volume. But the eschatological is central, and that's why in my first chapter in this book I present the marriage of God and humanity, which is the eschaton. Which is the fulfilled eschaton, the unfathomably glorious end for which we were made. I put that right up front. So the whole book is eschatological. Marriage is an eschatological sign because we live in the inaugurated kingdom. So for Christians, marriage is intrinsically eschatological. Now, on the other hand, it's profoundly human as well. And so I have a chapter where I focus on that. And the chapter is really about the ends or goods or purposes or meaning, in terms of at a human level, the meaning of marriage, the purpose of marriage at a human level. And there, of course, Augustine talks about 3 goods. And then the tradition also talks about 2 ends. Ends or goals of marriage in terms of marriage as a human reality. And these ends are talked about in terms of mutual love or the friendship of the couple, the couple's friendship, and then the good of children. Children are part of the meaning of marriage. There isn't really a Christian marriage where there's no intention to have children. But don't worry, the intention can be implicit. If you get married, when I got married, I wasn't sure that I wanted to have children, but it didn't matter. You see, so but children are fundamental to marriage, and that's part of the argument that I make is that Christians can't have a Christian understanding of marriage. And really, truly, you can't really have a human understanding of marriage if children are not part of that, because marriage, when it's the mother and father coming together, that's what differentiates it from any other kind of friendship. So I go into Aristotle and Plato and other different thinkers as I'm talking about this in the book, but the main point is that there's plenty of kinds of human friendship. And there's many diverse human friendships that are very fruitful, very valuable. People don't need to get married to have wonderful friendships and deep bonds and incredibly special relationships. But marriage, though, children are part of it, and that's where mutual love comes in as well. Because the bond between the husband and wife, the man and the woman, that's at the service of the other person. That bond is at the service of one's spouse, but ultimately at the service of children. It's a lifelong service. And so I think that's often forgotten in Christian marriage, how important this is. But I would really emphasize that the particular kind of bond that marriage is has to do with the good of children. So if you ask yourself, you want to have a good marriage, you really want to have a good marriage. Well, there is that opening out toward the community, toward a communion of persons. So if you're in a marriage and you can't have children, that doesn't mean that your marriage is not ordered to children. And so there's other ways of, whether it's adoption, or if adoption's not a possibility, there's also, and it's fine if adoption's not a possibility. There's many ways then of opening oneself up to the entire Christian community and mentoring and serving in all sorts of ways. But the normal way is going to be through children. And children honestly need that service, need their parents to give them that example of love and self-surrendering love and care. That goes on the whole life. So there's never a time when that stops. So that's part of how I think about marriage. Part of my book on marriage obviously is the contention that marriage is a sacrament. And of course, between Christians, this has been a bone of contention sometimes. Different Christians have different viewpoints, but that in part one of my ecumenical goals of the book is by simply beginning Christian reflection on marriage, beginning Christian reflection in terms of the marriage of God and humanity, the fulfillment in Jesus Christ of the promises given to Israel about the marriage of God and man. Part of the goal is just to indicate that essentially what is meant by marriage as a sacrament when Catholics and Orthodox talk that way, or of course or Anglicans or whoever sometimes, depending on which Anglicans are. There's Anglicans who hold that marriage as a sacrament. When it's talked about that way, what we're talking about is this eschatological dimension. This dimension of being caught up into something that isn't solely pertaining to natural capacities, but is really being caught up in a way that is grounded in Jesus Christ, into what Christ has done, into the power of His work, His saving work, and that power is His inauguration of His kingdom. And so marriage is a certain, at least in the Catholic understanding, marriage is a certain sharing in that power, in that grace, and that what marriage as a sacrament brings about is a certain sharing in what Christ has done. That when couples enter into the sacrament and do so intentionally and consciously, the grace there is present as part of strengthening them and uniting them more firmly as a sign, so that they can truly be a sign. So in other words, married couples become what you are. And you're not what you are just because of your nature. You're not what you are just because you're two really good people. You're not even what you are just because you're just two really friendly Christians. You're what you are because of Jesus Christ and because He has brought you into His kingdom. And that's the point of become what you are, become that sign that you are. And so there is a participation in Jesus Christ that's brought about through the sacrament of marriage, and that participation is powerful, and it does unite that couple and make them truly a sign of what they are, which is that sign of Christ and His church. Ephesians 5. But of course, I know that Ephesians 5 is contested in terms of biblical interpretation. I'm aware of that. So part of what I do in my book on marriage then is I go through reasons for not thinking of marriage as a sacrament, and my representative there is a fantastic Catholic scholar named Philip Reynolds, and he's done this great historical 1,000-page book with Cambridge, where he does shows that the Catholic Church invented marriage as a sacrament. But truly, he's not doing anything new. The whole idea that the Catholic Church invented marriage as a sacrament has a long pedigree. Anyway, there were these developments in the 12th century. That's kind of the key idea. But and then I go through certain responses to that, certain ways of thinking about what marriage is that indicate why it is that Catholics hold, along with Orthodox and others, why Catholics hold that marriage as a sacrament. But my purpose there is not polemical. The main thing is just to invite Catholic readers who often don't understand what it might even mean to call marriage as a sacrament. I'm trying to invite Catholic readers, but also Protestant readers, Orthodox readers. I'm inviting people to just think about why it is that we would call marriage a sacrament, when there was obviously development and understanding of that mystery, development over centuries. How it is that, how is marriage as something that the church sort of shapes and determines, or is it just simply a human institution that the church takes over? What is it? So that's the purpose of my reflection in that part of the book. Well, my book on marriage concludes by reflecting a little bit on marriage and social justice, because I know that social justice is an incredibly important concern for Christians. We care about our societies, and many of my fellow Christians and Christian theologians are now devoting themselves in a certain way full time to thinking about social justice issues in our communities. So oftentimes you'll have Christologies that are really focused entirely on issues of justice, or you'll have different kinds of theologies that are very justice centered in certain ways. You'll have ecological theologies and so on. So that's very important to me as well. And so in this book, part of the book is to think about marriage and social justice, because I think that Christian marriage, that's important. That's something we have to offer. The church has this to offer, to communities, both within the church and then without the church, outside the church, as it were, not without the church, but outside the church. The church has this to offer. It turns out that sociologists and many people who study these matters find that having a husband and a wife, a mother and a father, having them united, and having them raise their children, that's so incredibly important for establishing societies that truly are just, where children actually have a real chance to succeed and to become the people who they're meant to be. If the church cares about social justice, then the church has got to care about marriage. But sometimes we sort of romanticize that, or try to make other people feel guilty, that type of thing. And of course, that's not the purpose of my book. But my book is, I do want to say though that that marriage, in addition to having the eschatological component, marriage has a societal component, and this is, of course, what you would expect. So that's part of my book.